The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl's screams into a dark motor pool, and his wrath shattered the quiet steel. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was the kind of night that made the air feel like it was suffocating, the kind of stillness that only happens when something terrible is about to unfold. Jake Reaper Morrison, a man of steel and grit, rode through the darkness, his Harley-Davidson's engine rumbling like a distant storm. As he cut through the night, something about the quietness felt wrong, unnatural. It was a silence that screamed danger, but he couldn't place why. Then, out of nowhere, a high-pitched scream sliced through the air, so sharp it made his skin crawl. It was the scream of a little girl. Without a second thought, Jake slammed the brakes, his bike screeching to a halt. He stood frozen for a split second, listening. The scream came again, panicked, desperate. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect to hear in the middle of nowhere, in a motor pool so isolated that even the stars seemed too far to help. A cold shiver ran down Jake's spine. His instincts screamed at him to turn away, to leave before he got caught in something ugly. But this was different. This scream felt like a call to action, a plea for help that cut through the layers of his hardened soul. With a low growl, Jake dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he scanned the surroundings. He was standing on the edge of an old, dilapidated motor pool, surrounded by rusting car parts and abandoned machinery. The place smelled like oil and metal, a graveyard for vehicles and lives left behind. And yet, the scream echoed from deeper within, guiding him like a compass through the dark maze of steel. He took a step forward, then another, each footfall heavier than the last. As he moved closer, his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and there, behind a row of old trucks, he saw her, small, fragile, with wide, terrified eyes that locked onto his. The girl was barely 7. Her clothes ragged, her face streaked with dirt and fear. She was crouched by a broken-down engine, her body trembling in the cold. Jake's heart twisted in his chest, but he quickly masked it, replacing his humanity with the cold exterior of a Hell's Angel. "Hey there," he called, his voice rough and gravelly. She flinched, her eyes growing even wider, as if the sight of him was more terrifying than the situation she was in. Jake took another step forward, lowering his voice, trying to soothe her. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." He took off his leather jacket, tossing it gently over her small shoulders. She shivered under the warmth, but didn't speak. Instead, she pointed behind her, to a dark corner of the motor pool. Jake's eyes followed her trembling finger, and for a moment, he hesitated. He could feel it, the presence of something darker, something watching them. But it didn't matter. He had a job to do. The girl was his responsibility now. Without another word, Jake moved toward the corner, where a man was standing, his face hidden in the shadows, his body tense and ready to strike. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't just a rescue. It was about to become a war. Jake stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel as he kept his eyes locked on the man in the shadows. The faint light from the flickering bulb above did little to reveal the figure lurking in the dark corner of the motor pool, but Jake could sense the tension in the air. This wasn't just some random encounter. It was a setup, and the man standing there knew it. The girl's fear was a clear sign, and Jake wasn't about to let anyone harm her, not on his watch. The stranger shifted slightly, his hands twitching as if ready to draw a weapon. Jake's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his own knife, but he didn't make a move yet. He was calculating, sizing up the threat. "You've got one chance to walk away," Jake growled, his voice low and steady, like the calm before a storm. The man didn't respond right away, instead stepping forward just enough to reveal his face, a sinister smirk playing on his lips. The scars on his face were as jagged as his intentions. "You think I'm scared of you, biker?" he sneered. Jake didn't flinch. He knew better than to get caught in a taunting game. Instead, he focused on the girl, still huddled by the engine, her small frame trembling beneath the jacket he had given her. The girl's eyes were wide, and her lips quivered as she tried to steady her breathing. but she couldn't hide the raw panic that consumed her. She had seen something that made her so afraid that she couldn't even speak. Jake took another step forward, blocking her view of the man in the corner. He wasn't about to let her witness any more violence tonight. "Get out of here," Jake commanded, his voice cutting through the air with authority. But the man didn't move. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, his voice dripping with malice. "You think I'm afraid of you? You're just a faded memory, a washed-up biker with nothing left but a leather jacket and broken promises." The insult was meant to provoke, but Jake wasn't rattled. He had been through worse. He had seen things that would haunt most men for a lifetime, but they didn't scare him anymore. What scared him now was what might happen to this little girl if he didn't act quickly. He couldn't waste any more time on this man's words. Without warning, Jake lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a flash. His fist collided with the man's jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. The man groaned, struggling to get up, but Jake was already on top of him, pinning him down with a force that came from years of experience. "Stay down, and stay quiet," Jake growled through gritted teeth. He wasn't going to kill him, yet. The man's eyes widened in fear, but it was too late for him. Jake had already won the fight. He stood up and turned back toward the girl, his focus shifting instantly. The man was irrelevant now. "It's okay," Jake said gently, his voice softer as he crouched down to her level. The girl looked up at him, her eyes still wide with fear, but there was a glimmer of trust beginning to form. "You're safe now," Jake reassured her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He could feel her trembling beneath his touch, and for a moment, he allowed himself to soften. This wasn't the tough biker persona that everyone knew. This was Jake, the man who still had a heart beneath the layers of leather and tattoos. The girl let out a shaky breath, and for the first time that night, she spoke. I thought he was going to kill me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake's heart clenched at her words. He had been in her shoes once, long ago. He had felt that same fear, the kind that could paralyze you, the kind that made you believe there was no way out. But he was her way out. He had to be. "Not while I'm here," Jake said firmly. The girl's eyes finally started to calm, and she nodded, her small hand reaching out to grip his. Jake stood up, helping her to her feet. "Let's get you out of here," he said, scanning the area one last time to make sure they were safe. He could still hear the man groaning in the background, but Jake didn't care anymore. He had no intention of letting him get up. He had bigger things to worry about. The girl was his responsibility now. As Jake guided her toward the exit of the motor pool, his thoughts raced. This was only the beginning. He didn't know who the man in the shadows was or why he was after the girl, but Jake had a feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. He could sense the danger still lurking, and he knew that he couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. The girl's life depended on it. Jake led the girl out of the motor pool, his eyes scanning the area one last time. The night felt thicker now, heavier with the kind of tension that had a way of seeping into your bones. The cold air cut through him, but it wasn't the chill of winter that had his muscles tight with readiness. No, it was the sensation that they were being watched, and that no matter how fast they moved, they weren't alone. The girl stumbled beside him, her small hand gripping his sleeve, and Jake's focus shifted back to her. Her dark eyes were still wide, full of the kind of fear that shouldn't belong to a child. He wasn't a father, never had been, but there was something about her that hit him deep, like the last string of a long-forgotten memory. He'd been that scared kid once, the kind who was afraid to even ask for help, let alone trust someone enough to offer it. But now, she had no choice but to trust him. "I won't let anything happen to you," Jake muttered under his breath, mostly to reassure himself. He led her through the rusted gates of the motor pool, past the rows of abandoned cars, and through the alley that ran behind a series of dilapidated warehouses. The place felt like the last part of the world anyone should ever be. The girl didn't speak as they walked, her silence loud in the space between them. Jake didn't push her to talk, knowing that some things couldn't be forced. She had been through more than anyone should have to experience, and the last thing he wanted was to rush her into a conversation she wasn't ready to have. The street ahead looked empty, eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic on the main road. But as they rounded the corner, Jake froze. His instincts flared, sending a warning straight to his gut. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he heard the faintest sound, footsteps, quick and deliberate, coming from the shadows. Without a word, He pulled the girl closer, his free hand moving to the back of his waistband where his knife was sheathed. "Stay close," he whispered. She nodded, and Jake took a few cautious steps forward, his eyes darting from corner to corner, looking for any sign of movement. His heart pounded, and his grip on the knife tightened. He wasn't the type to back down, not when someone else's safety was on the line. The footsteps grew louder, and Jake's muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, tall and lean, with a hood pulled over his face. The guy wasn't alone. Behind him, two more figures stepped into view, all of them moving with the kind of practiced precision that told Jake they weren't new to this. "You're making a mistake," Jake said, his voice low and steady. He wasn't sure how many of them there were, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of thinking they had the upper hand. The three men stopped just a few feet away, their eyes hidden in the shadows, but Jake could feel their stares like a physical force. The man in front of him stepped forward, his face partially visible under the hood. "You don't know who you're messing with," the man said, his voice flat, cold. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. The girl was still clinging to him, her small body pressed against his side, and he could feel her heart racing. The situation was escalating fast. Jake's gaze flicked to the alley behind them, his mind running through the possible escape routes. But the men weren't giving him any options. "I'm not asking for trouble," Jake said. "But if you're looking for a fight, I'm happy to oblige." He stepped in front of the girl, his posture tense, his stance wide and ready for anything. The man in front of him chuckled darkly, his hand reaching for something at his waist. Jake didn't wait. In one fluid motion, he drew his knife and stepped into the man's space, pushing him back with a sharp shove. The other two lunged, but Jake was faster. He sidestepped one and twisted, driving his knee into the other's stomach with brutal force. The man gasped, crumpling to the ground as Jake spun back to face the leader. "You're not leaving here without a fight," Jake said, his voice edged with a cold promise. The leader drew his weapon, a crowbar, heavy and long. Jake didn't flinch. He'd dealt with worse. The fight erupted into chaos. The leader swung, but Jake was already moving, ducking low and sweeping the man's feet out from under him. The crowbar crashed into the pavement with a loud clang as Jake grabbed it and twisted it from his hands. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He moved with precision, like he was in control of every second. The girl stayed behind him, her presence a constant reminder of why he couldn't afford to slip up. Finally, with one last strike, the leader went down, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The alley fell silent, save for the distant hum of traffic. Jake stood over the man, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He turned to the girl, who was now staring at him, wide-eyed but oddly calm. "You're okay?" Jake said, his voice softer now. She nodded, though she still didn't speak. Jake didn't need words. He knew she was scared, but he also knew she was stronger than she looked. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for now, they were alive, and that was enough. Jake stood still for a moment, his breath heavy as he took in the aftermath. The two men on the ground weren't moving, and the leader lay sprawled out, knocked out cold. But Jake knew better than to relax. He wasn't done yet. He glanced at the girl, who was still standing behind him, clutching his jacket tightly, her wide eyes locked on the chaos around them. She didn't make a sound, but Jake could see the fear still lingering in her expression. It was the kind of fear that didn't just go away. It was embedded deep, and it was something that would take time to heal. He moved toward her slowly, his footsteps measured, ensuring that she felt his presence and not the threat that had just been dealt with. "It's over now," Jake said gently, his voice softer than it had been during the fight. She looked up at him, the flickering light from the nearby street lamp catching the edges of her face, illuminating the dirt streaked on her cheeks. She was small, fragile, really, and Jake couldn't help but feel a protective urge rise within him. He had spent most of his life thinking he wasn't capable of feelings like this. He'd buried those parts of himself long ago, convinced that the Hell's Angels code left no room for tenderness. But standing here with this little girl, he realized how wrong he had been. The girl nodded, but there was a hesitance in her movement. She was still processing everything that had just happened, and Jake didn't blame her. He wasn't sure he could process it all either. The adrenaline was wearing off, and his body was starting to feel the effects of the fight. But he couldn't show that. Not yet. Let's get you out of here, Jake said. He turned toward the alley, glancing back one last time at the men on the ground. They would live. But Jake was done with them. He wouldn't waste any more time on people like that. His eyes flicked to the street ahead, the path that would lead them out of this forgotten part of town. As he started walking, the girl followed him closely, her small hand gripping his sleeve once more. It was a quiet walk, the kind that felt too heavy to say anything. But Jake didn't need to fill the silence with words. They both knew what had just happened. They both knew that it was far from over. The girl's breathing had steadied, but the tension in the air hadn't left. Every step they took, every shadow that stretched across their path, made Jake more aware of how vulnerable they still were. There was no guarantee they were safe yet. He had seen enough to know that danger never truly disappeared. It just waited for the right moment to strike again. As they rounded the corner of a block, Jake stopped abruptly. His eyes darted around, scanning the street for anything out of place. His instincts flared again, warning him of something, though he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. "Stay close," he whispered, more to himself than to her. She nodded without hesitation, her small frame shrinking further into his shadow. Jake could feel the weight of the night settling on his shoulders, a weight that had nothing to do with the physical strain of the fight. It was the weight of responsibility. He had always been a lone wolf, a man who lived by his own rules and answered to no one. But now, with this girl beside him, everything had changed. He was responsible for her safety, for getting her out of whatever hell she had just survived. And he wasn't sure how long he could keep that promise. "I need to get you to a safe place," Jake muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He wasn't sure where that place was yet, but he knew it was out there somewhere. His mind was racing, running through options. But there was no time to waste. Not when there were people who wanted the girl back, who would stop at nothing to get her. He could feel their eyes on him, even though he hadn't seen them yet. He knew they were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He would never let that happen. As they continued down the street, Jake felt a sudden pull in his gut. It wasn't just the threat of danger. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. His mind raced with the possibilities, but nothing came to him. It didn't matter. For now, all that mattered was getting the girl to safety. They turned another corner, and Jake's eyes scanned the street. He knew they were being followed, but he wasn't sure by whom. The girl was still walking silently beside him, and Jake could feel the tightness in her grip on his sleeve. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be okay, but the truth was, he didn't know that. All he knew was that he couldn't stop moving. Not now. Not until she was safe. They passed an old diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance, and Jake's eyes narrowed. He knew this part of town. He knew the people who hung out here. It was a place where deals were made in the shadows, where nobody asked questions unless they were ready to answer them. And Jake wasn't ready for that kind of conversation. He needed a place to lay low, a place where they could disappear for a while. "We're almost there," Jake said, glancing down at the girl, trying to reassure her. She didn't respond, but her grip tightened just slightly. He could feel her fear, and it made his heart ache. The girl had been through more than anyone should ever have to endure. But Jake would make sure it didn't break her. He would make sure of it, even if it cost him everything. Jake kept walking, his boots heavy against the cracked pavement, the cold air pressing against his face as they moved further down the darkened street. His mind raced with every step, trying to piece together what was happening, trying to make sense of the mess he'd just walked into. He had expected trouble tonight. He always did, but he hadn't expected this. The girl beside him, her small hand clutching his sleeve, had changed everything. As much as Jake tried to keep his focus, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He'd grown up on the streets. He knew when something didn't feel right, and tonight, it felt like the city was holding its breath. They reached a small, run-down building at the end of the street, its windows cracked and the lights flickering weakly from within. It wasn't much, but it was safe for now. Jake opened the door and led the girl inside, his hand on her shoulder to guide her. The building smelled like dust and stale air, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was a place for forgotten things, just like him. "Stay here," Jake said, his voice low as he stepped back, giving her a moment of space. The girl didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes still wide with the fear that hadn't quite left her. Jake stepped into the far corner of the room, his eyes scanning the area for anything useful, anything that could help them in the coming hours. He wasn't sure how long they would stay here, but he knew they couldn't afford to rest for long. His mind kept drifting back to the men in the alley. They weren't the only ones looking for the girl. He could feel it in his gut, a warning that never failed him. Someone was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jake's thoughts were interrupted when he heard a small sound behind him. He turned to find the girl standing a few feet away, her eyes focused on him. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with the fear of someone who had seen too much. Jake didn't answer immediately. He had always been a man of action, but now, with her eyes on him, he felt the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't used to being needed, but now, with the girl standing in front of him, there was no turning back. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, finally finding the words. "But first, you need to get some rest." The girl shook her head, her eyes flashing with something between anger and frustration. "I can't rest. Not with what happened, not with what I saw." Jake understood. She wasn't ready to sleep, not yet. And maybe he wasn't either. But they had to. They needed to gather their strength for whatever came next. "Listen," Jake said, his voice steady. "I don't know what you've been through, but we're safe for now. I'll keep you safe. Just trust me." The girl's gaze softened for a moment, but then she turned away, her hands folding into fists at her sides. She didn't speak, but Jake could see the storm of emotions running through her. She had been through too much to process it all at once. Jake couldn't blame her for that. He had been running from his own demons for years, burying them deep enough to forget, or at least pretend to. But now, in this dark, forgotten place, they were both facing something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. He couldn't afford to let her down, and he couldn't afford to fall apart. Jake walked over to the girl, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. "I know it's not easy," he said quietly, "but we have to stick together. You and me. We get through this, and then we'll figure out what comes next." The girl didn't say anything for a long moment, but finally, she nodded. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. She didn't trust him completely. He didn't expect her to. But it was a start. He didn't know what the next few hours would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her face it alone. He turned away from her, heading for the corner of the room where he had noticed a small cot. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He knew it wasn't safe to rest, but they both needed sleep. He'd be ready to move when the time came. As he set up the cot, the girl stood by the window, staring out into the night, her face shadowed by the dim light. Jake glanced at her once more, but said nothing. He wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he knew that whatever it was something only she could work through. For now, all he could do was be there for her. He lay down on the cot, his eyes closing as he tried to focus on the sounds of the city outside. The girl's breathing grew quieter, slower, and eventually, she was still. Jake allowed himself a moment of rest, though his mind never fully stopped. There was too much at stake. Too much they didn't understand. The girl had been a target once. She would be again. And Jake wouldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let anyone hurt her. Not on his watch. Jake awoke to the sound of distant footsteps, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His mind, still foggy from the little sleep he'd managed to get, snapped into focus. He sat up slowly on the cot, every muscle in his body tense, as if the night had already warned him that danger was closing in. The girl was still asleep on the chair near the window, her small body curled up in the oversized jacket Jake had given her. He stood up quietly, moving towards the window. From this angle, the alley outside looked still, but Jake knew better than to trust the calm. He peered through the broken blinds, his eyes scanning every shadow. There were no signs of movement, but something didn't sit right. It was too quiet. He could almost feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, making the air thick with tension. He turned away from the window, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here much longer. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. Jake had been in enough sticky situations to know that staying put was the fastest way to become a target. He walked over to the girl and crouched down beside her, gently shaking her shoulder. "Hey, wake up," Jake whispered. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, still clouded by sleep. When she finally met his gaze, there was a flicker of recognition, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice still heavy with exhaustion. "We need to move," Jake said quietly. It's not safe here anymore. She nodded, her small hand reaching up to tug the jacket tighter around her shoulders. Jake quickly grabbed the bag he'd stashed under the cot and slung it over his shoulder. They didn't have much, but it was enough to get by for a little while. They needed to get to a safer place, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. Stay close to me, Jake said as he moved toward the door, glancing around the room one last time. The silence felt oppressive, but Jake knew it wasn't over yet. It wasn't even close. The streets outside were just as empty as they had been the night before, but Jake didn't let his guard down. The city had a way of hiding danger in plain sight, and Jake was used to being the one to spot it before. It found him. He motioned for the girl to follow, his steps steady and deliberate. They walked in silence, the only sounds being the soft scrape of their shoes against the pavement and the occasional distant hum of a passing car. Jake's instincts were on high alert, but there was no immediate threat. For now, it was just the two of them, trying to make their way through a city that felt both familiar and foreign. Where are we going? The girl asked after a few minutes, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Somewhere safe, he replied simply. He wasn't ready to give her the full story yet. She didn't need to know everything. Not yet. The less she knew, the safer she would be. The journey felt endless, every corner holding the potential for danger. Jake was used to the grind of city life, the constant moving, the need to stay one step ahead. But this felt different. The weight of responsibility was heavier now, and it wasn't just his own safety he was worried about. It was hers. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He had promised to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise. After what felt like hours, they reached a more populated area of the city. The streets were busier here, and Jake could feel the girl relax slightly as the presence of people gave her a sense of security. But Jake wasn't fooled. He knew that being around people didn't always mean safety. There were eyes everywhere, watching, waiting. He scanned the crowd quickly, his gaze sharp and calculating. Nothing seemed out of place, but Jake had learned long ago to trust his gut. He wasn't about to take any chances. Keep walking, he instructed, his voice firm. The girl kept pace with him, though her steps were still hesitant, unsure. Jake couldn't blame her. She had been through more than any kid should have to endure. He just hoped she would never have to go through any more. They turned a corner and entered a small diner. The kind of place that felt stuck in time, with old booths and a counter that had seen better days. Jake didn't even look at the menu as he slid into one of the booths, motioning for the girl to sit next to him. The diner was quiet, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. Jake glanced at the waitress, who was busy wiping down the counter, and then back at the girl. You hungry? He asked, his voice softer now. The girl nodded but didn't say anything. Jake could tell she was exhausted, but he couldn't let her fall asleep just yet. They needed to keep moving. He caught the waitress's attention and ordered coffee for himself, a glass of water for the girl. They sat in silence for a few moments, and Jake allowed himself a rare moment of respite. But it didn't last long. He could feel the weight of everything building, the pressure of what was to come. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking for them. And when they did, Jake would be ready. Jake sat in the booth, his eyes scanning the small diner. The faded walls, the smell of old grease, the hum of the refrigerator. It was a far cry from the life he had known, the life he had built from the ground up, one deal and one fight at a time. But now, it felt like all of that was slipping away. He wasn't sure if it was because of the girl sitting next to him, or the sudden weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The door to the diner jingled as it opened, and Jake's senses went on high alert. He didn't look up, but he knew someone had entered. The footsteps weren't heavy, not in the way of someone looking for trouble, but they were deliberate, the kind of steps that made Jake's instincts flare. He kept his focus on the girl, who was still staring into her glass of water. She hadn't touched it yet. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her body was tense. Jake could feel her unease. She was still terrified, and who could blame her? He could tell that whatever had happened to her, whatever she had seen, was eating her alive from the inside. He could see it in her eyes, the kind of look a person gets when they've been through something no one should have to face. Jake wasn't sure how to help her. He wasn't sure if he could. His world had never been about fixing broken things. It was about survival. But now, with her beside him, things were different. He had to protect her, keep her safe, and he couldn't afford to fail. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "You should eat," he said. The girl looked up at him, her eyes tired, but there was something else in them now. It wasn't just fear. It was something like trust, or maybe just an acknowledgement that she didn't have to be alone anymore. She nodded but didn't say anything. Jake let out a sigh, rubbing his hand over his face. He needed to focus. They couldn't stay here forever. "I'll be back in a minute," he said, standing up and pushing the door to the restroom open. The last thing he wanted was to leave her alone, but they needed to get moving. Jake moved quickly, making sure no one else was paying them too much attention. The bathroom was small, and he locked the door behind him. He needed to think. As he leaned against the sink, staring into the cracked mirror, his mind raced. They couldn't stay in the diner for long. He had to get her out of town. He had to get them both out of danger. But where would they go? Jake's mind kept returning to the men from the alley, the ones who had been after the girl. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the only ones looking for her. Whoever was behind this was not going to give up. Jake needed a plan, and fast. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He splashed cold water on his face and stood up, shaking off the weight of the situation. He had been through worse. He could handle this. The girl was counting on him. He opened the door and stepped back into the diner, his eyes immediately scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but Jake wasn't the type to relax. He needed to be ready for whatever came next. He walked back to the booth, but before he could sit down, a man slid into the seat across from him. Jake froze, his hand instinctively moving to his belt, where his knife was sheathed. The man was wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by a pair of sunglasses, even though it was the middle of the day. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Jake, sizing him up. Jake didn't blink. He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him, not now, not ever. "You're the one they're looking for," the man finally said, his voice low and calm. Jake's stomach dropped, but he didn't let it show. He had heard this line before. "Who's looking for me?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. The man smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "It's not you they want. It's her," he said, motioning toward the girl. Jake's eyes flicked to the girl, who had been quietly watching the exchange. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't say a word. She didn't even look like she was going to run. Jake could feel the weight of her silence. She knew exactly what was at stake. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice cold. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, his lips curling into a grin. "I don't think you're in a position to ask questions, friend. But I'll tell you this. You're in the way." Jake's heart began to pound, and his grip tightened on the knife at his side. He wasn't about to let this man, or anyone else, threaten the girl. Not while he was still breathing. The man must have sensed the shift in Jake's stance because he leaned back, his grin faltering slightly. "You can keep running, but it won't be long before we find you. And when we do, there won't be a place left to hide." Jake stared at him, his jaw clenched. "Get out," he growled. The man's smile returned, but it was more dangerous this time, as if he knew something Jake didn't. "You'll regret this," the man said, standing up. He turned and walked toward the door without another word. Jake didn't watch him leave. His attention was on the girl now. She was trembling again, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes. He knew it wasn't over. It wasn't even close. But he was ready. He had to be. Jake watched the man leave the diner, his steps slow but deliberate, like he knew exactly how much time he had left. The door jangled as it closed behind him, the sound lingering in the quiet room. Jake didn't take his eyes off the spot, where the man had been, his mind spinning with everything that had just been said. The girl beside him was still shaking, her eyes darting between Jake and the door. She looked as if she were about to speak, but the words never came. It was like she was too afraid of what might happen next. Jake couldn't blame her. He had been in the same place before, facing danger that felt inevitable, where every move you made only brought more problems. The man's warning wasn't something Jake could ignore, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He couldn't let anyone find them. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. He glanced around the diner, but it was still quiet, the same few customers sitting at the counter, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. Jake turned back to the girl, his face softening. "We need to leave. Now." She nodded, her eyes wide, and followed him without a word. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Jake felt a wave of unease hit him. The street was still as empty as it had been when they first arrived, but the city felt different now, like everything was closing in on them, the walls getting higher with each passing second. They didn't have much time. Jake kept his pace quick, his steps measured, as he led the girl down the street. His mind raced, considering their options. The man had made it clear that they weren't safe here, but Jake wasn't sure where to go next. His first instinct was to get to a safer part of town, somewhere they could lay low and figure out their next move, but he didn't know where that was anymore. He didn't trust anyone. Not now. Not after the last few days. He glanced at the girl, who was walking silently beside him, her gaze fixed on the ground. She hadn't spoken since the man had left the diner. Jake could feel the weight of her silence, and he knew that she was still processing everything that had happened. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. She looked up at him, her expression blank, but there was a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe fear, in her eyes. She didn't answer, and Jake didn't push her. He knew she needed time, just like he did. But the clock was ticking, and they had no time to waste. They turned down another street, passing empty storefronts and silent alleys. Jake kept his eyes sharp, constantly scanning their surroundings. He could feel the pressure building, the sense that they were being watched. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia, but he wasn't going to take any chances. As they rounded the corner, Jake heard the sound of a car's engine starting. His head snapped in the direction of the noise, and his hand instinctively moved toward the knife at his side. A black SUV slowly rolled past them, its headlights cutting through the dark. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the car slowed to a stop just ahead. He didn't need to see the driver's face to know that this wasn't a coincidence. He motioned for the girl to stay close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get down." They ducked into a nearby alley, pressing themselves against the cold brick wall. Jake's breath was shallow as he watched the SUV through the gap in the buildings. The car was parked now, the engine running, and he could see shadows moving inside. His fingers tightened around the knife's handle, ready for whatever was coming next. For a long moment, nothing happened. The SUV sat motionless, its headlights casting long shadows across the street. But Jake knew that it wouldn't be long before they were spotted. He could feel the tension mounting in the air, thick and suffocating. And then, the door of the SUV swung open. Jake's instincts flared. He stepped forward, ready to make a move, but before he could act, a familiar voice called out from the street. "Jake!" It was the last voice he wanted to hear right now. He turned slowly, his heart sinking in his chest, as he saw the man from the diner stepping out of the shadows. His sunglasses were gone now, revealing cold, calculating eyes that locked onto Jake's. "I thought you'd be smarter than this," the man said, his voice steady but laced with a dangerous edge. Jake's hand tightened around the knife, but he didn't make a move. He had to stay calm, keep his head in the game. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice low and firm. The man took a step forward, his hands casually shoved into his jacket pockets. "It's not what I want," he said, his lips curling into a smirk. "It's what she's got." He nodded toward the girl, who was standing behind Jake, her face pale and terrified. Jake's stomach turned. He wasn't going to let this man, or anyone, take her from him. "You're not getting her," Jake growled, his voice rising. The man chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of someone who knew they had the upper hand. "You can keep running," he said, his voice full of dark promise. "But sooner or later, we'll find you. And when we do, there won't be anywhere left for you to hide." Jake took a step forward, putting himself between the man and the girl. "I said, you're not taking her." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice like ice. And with that, he turned and walked back toward the SUV, the door slamming shut behind him. The car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. Jake stood there, his heart pounding, his body tense, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He had just made it personal. Jake stood still, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the spot where the SUV had vanished into the night. The man's words echoed in his head, each one heavier than the last. He wasn't getting away this time. They couldn't keep running forever. Jake knew that, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. Not while she was with him. The girl's hand was still gripping the back of his jacket, her small fingers barely visible beneath the fabric. He turned to face her, his voice calm but firm. "We need to move. Now." She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them now. A spark. A silent acknowledgement that she was ready to keep going, that she trusted him to lead the way. Jake turned and started walking down the street, his pace quick but deliberate. They needed to stay out of sight. They couldn't afford to be followed again. As they moved, Jake's thoughts raced. The man in the diner, the warning he'd given. It was only the beginning. Jake wasn't sure what they were after, but he could feel the danger closing in, like a storm on the horizon, too far away to stop, but fast approaching. He had to make sure they stayed ahead of it. He glanced back at the girl. She was still keeping pace with him, though her steps were slower now, as if she were carrying more than just her own weight. He couldn't blame her. The last few days had been a blur of fear and uncertainty, a world that had turned upside down for her. She didn't deserve this. Jake clenched his jaw, the familiar ache of guilt tugging at his chest. But there was no time for self-pity. Not now. He had made a promise to protect her, and he intended to keep it. The streets ahead seemed to stretch on forever, dark and empty, like a maze with no way out. But Jake had been in situations like this before, facing danger from every angle, running on nothing but instinct and the need to survive. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. As they reached the end of the street, Jake spotted a small alleyway to their right. It was dark, the kind of alley that most people would avoid. Perfect. He turned toward it and motioned for the girl to follow. They stepped into the shadows, the world outside fading away as they walked deeper into the narrow space. The alley was silent, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. Jake's senses were on high alert now. He could feel the weight of the city pressing down on him, the constant hum of life all around them, but nothing felt safe. Not anymore. He stopped in front of a rusted door that led into an old storage building. The door was partially ajar, the hinges creaking as he pushed it open. He didn't hesitate, stepping inside and motioning for the girl to follow him. The building was dim, the only light coming from a few broken windows high above them. It smelled of dust and old wood, and the air felt thick, like it had been untouched for years. Jake moved quickly, scanning the area for any sign of movement. It was empty, or at least it seemed that way. He led the girl further into the building, his mind still racing. They needed a plan, but Jake didn't have one. Not yet. All he knew was that they couldn't stay in one place for too long. He found a corner near the back of the building, out of view from the door. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. He motioned for the girl to sit down, and she did, her small form huddling in the corner as she pulled her knees up to her chest. Jake sat across from her, his back against the cold wall, his eyes constantly moving, watching for any signs of danger. He had no idea how long they would be here, or what the next step would be. All he knew was that the man from the diner would be back. He could feel it in his bones. The girl's eyes were still on him, her face pale in the low light. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake hesitated. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they were safe, but he couldn't lie to her. "Not now. For now," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "But we can't stay long. We need to keep moving." The girl nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she believed him. And how could she? Everything had been ripped away from her in an instant. The world she knew was gone, replaced by a dark reality where survival was the only thing that mattered. Jake clenched his fists, the weight of responsibility pressing harder on him. He wasn't just keeping her alive, he was her only chance. He couldn't fail. He had been running from his past for years, burying his mistakes in the shadows. But now, with this girl beside him, he had to face them head on. The truth was, he had no idea what would happen next. But he would fight, with everything he had, to protect her. The night outside was still silent, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Danger was coming. He could feel it. But for now, the girl was safe. And that would have to be enough. Jake didn't sleep. Not really. The weight of everything was too much, too pressing. The building around them was still, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of the old wood or the distant hum of the city outside. But Jake knew silence like this was always the calm before the storm. His eyes kept darting to the door, his mind running through every possible scenario. The man from the diner hadn't been lying. They had been followed, and he wasn't going to stop until he found them. Jake's grip tightened on the knife at his side. He wasn't going to make it easy for anyone. The girl was asleep now, her head resting against the wall, her body curled up as best as it could on the cold floor. Jake watched her, his chest tightening at the sight of her. So small, so vulnerable. She didn't deserve this. No one did. But it was too late for that. All he could do now was protect her. He had sworn to keep her safe, and that was a promise he intended to keep. He couldn't rest. He couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. He had made mistakes before, big ones, but he couldn't afford to make another one. Not this time. He stood up, stretching his sore limbs before quietly moving to the window. He peered through the grime-covered glass, scanning the empty street below. The dim streetlights barely illuminated the road, casting long shadows across the pavement. Everything looked calm, too calm. Jake's instincts told him that the calm was the most dangerous part. As he stared out into the night, his thoughts went back to the man who had confronted him earlier. The man had been confident, almost too confident. He wasn't just a random thug. Jake could feel it. This wasn't over. They were just getting started. Jake turned away from the window, his eyes lingering on the girl for a moment longer. She hadn't stirred. She needed the rest, and he couldn't take that from her. He had promised to keep her safe, and that meant protecting her from the nightmares too. He moved quietly to the door, checking to make sure it was still secure. His hand brushed the handle lightly, just enough to test its give. It didn't budge. Good. He had learned the hard way that even a second of distraction could cost you everything. As he stood there, his back against the door, his mind raced through options. He needed to get them out of the city. Somewhere remote, somewhere no one would think to look. But every road he considered led to more risk. He couldn't trust anyone here. Not anymore. His best bet was to keep moving, stay one step ahead of whoever was hunting them. But that meant leaving this place, and Jake didn't feel ready to take that next step just yet. The girl needed time, too. She needed to process what had happened to her, and they needed a plan. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was that someone would find them. He couldn't take that risk. Jake sighed heavily, dragging a hand down his face. There was no easy answer, no simple way out. He wasn't the hero of some story. He wasn't here to save the day. He was just a man trying to do the right thing, trying to protect someone who didn't have a chance unless he kept her safe. Jake glanced at the girl again, the quiet weight of the night settling over him. He had to keep moving, keep her safe. He couldn't afford to hesitate. As he paced the small space, his mind returned to the man from the alley, the one who had followed them to the diner. Jake had learned to read people quickly, and the look in the man's eyes had been more than just a threat. It had been personal. The girl was the key to something bigger, something that Jake didn't fully understand yet, but he was about to find out. He could feel it in his gut, the growing sense that whatever this was, it was going to tear through everything in its path. And they were right in the middle of it. He turned back to the girl, who was still asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. For a brief moment, Jake let himself feel the weight of the situation. It was heavy, crushing even, but that wasn't going to stop him. It couldn't. He had made it this far, and he would keep going. He couldn't let her down now. Jake walked over to the cot where he had been sitting down heavily. His hands ran through his hair, his mind still racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't stay here for long, but they couldn't leave just yet either. He needed a plan. He needed information. And most of all, he needed time. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she just looked at him, her face still pale, but there was something softer in her eyes now. A recognition, maybe, or just the first hint of trust. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Jake could see it in her eyes. She was scared, but she wasn't alone anymore. "We'll get through this," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to her. She nodded slowly, her gaze not leaving his face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And right now, that was all Jake needed. The sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Too deliberate, too steady to be ignored. Jake's senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body coiled tight, like a spring ready to snap. The girl was still asleep, her body curled up tightly in the corner. Jake didn't have to check again to know that they weren't alone. His mind raced as he slowly moved to the window, keeping his steps silent. He peered through the grime-covered glass, his eyes scanning the street. There was no sign of the SUV, no sign of anyone watching. But Jake had learned a long time ago to never trust the calm. The city had a way of hiding danger in plain sight, and tonight, it felt like danger was creeping closer. He moved away from the window and quietly crossed the room, kneeling down beside the girl. She was still breathing softly, her face peaceful, but Jake knew that peace wouldn't last long. They were running out of time. He gently shook her shoulder, his voice low. "Hey, wake up." She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, still fogged with sleep. When she met his gaze, the fear was still there, just beneath the surface, but there was something else too. Something softer. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered. Jake leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "We have to leave. Now." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. She had learned by now that when Jake said something, he meant it. She stood up and followed him as he motioned toward the back door. They didn't have the luxury of taking their time. As Jake slipped out into the alley, his eyes scanned the surroundings. The street was empty, the night still, but that didn't mean they were safe. He moved quickly, keeping a pace that wouldn't tire the girl but was fast enough to keep them ahead of whatever was coming. The alley was narrow, the air thick with the smell of garbage and old concrete, but it offered the cover they needed. Jake didn't stop to look back. He couldn't. Not now. Ever since he had told him they were being hunted, and he had no intention of making it easy for whoever was after them. The girl kept close, her footsteps barely audible, but Jake could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't as scared now, not like before. Maybe it was because she was starting to trust him, or maybe it was because she knew she didn't have a choice. Either way, they had to keep moving. They emerged from the alley into a dimly lit street that led toward the outskirts of town. The buildings here were older, their facades weathered by time, and the streets were quieter. This was the kind of place where people came to hide. Jake wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse, but it would have to do for now. He turned to the girl, his voice low. "Stay close to me. Don't make a sound." She nodded, the silent understanding between them heavier than any words could express. They walked quickly but quietly, sticking to the shadows, staying out of sight. Every corner, every turn, Jake's mind worked in overdrive, calculating the risks, finding the best way forward. But nothing felt certain. The girl's presence beside him was a constant reminder of how high the stakes were. He couldn't afford to fail. They had come too far. Jake glanced back once more, his instincts telling him that someone was out there, following them, just waiting for the right moment to strike. As they reached a deserted part of town, Jake spotted a small bar at the end of the street. The neon sign flickered weakly, but it was a place he recognized. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, a forgotten corner of the city where nobody asked questions. Jake stopped in front of the bar, turning to the girl. "We'll be safe here. For now." She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes told him she understood. He pushed the door open, the faint sound of a bell ringing as they entered. The inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and stale smoke. A few regulars sat at the bar, talking in hushed tones, but no one paid them much attention. Jake knew the owner of this place, a man who owed him a few favors, and he wasn't about to let anyone bother them. He walked toward the back of the bar, the girl following closely behind. The owner, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, looked up as Jake approached. "What's the deal, Reaper?" he asked, his voice low but friendly. "We need to lay low for a while," Jake replied. The owner nodded, his eyes flicking to the girl standing behind Jake. "You got it. Back room's empty. You'll be fine." Jake didn't hesitate. He motioned for the girl to follow him as they made their way to the back room. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a small, dimly lit space with a worn-out couch and a table covered in old paperwork. It wasn't much, but it would keep them safe for now. Jake closed the door behind them, locking it securely. He turned to the girl, who was already sitting on the couch, her eyes wide and alert. "Get some rest," Jake said softly. She didn't respond, but Jake could see that she was exhausted, just like he was. He didn't know how long they could stay here or what would happen next, but for the first time in days, they had a moment of quiet. It wouldn't last long, but it was enough to give them both the briefest sense of peace. Jake sat down next to her, his back against the wall, eyes scanning the room. He didn't trust anyone in this town, not anymore. But he trusted the owner of the bar, and right now, that was enough. For now, it was safe. But Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way. Not for long. Jake sat in the dimly lit back room of the bar, his back pressed against the wall, eyes fixed on the door. The girl was still sitting on the worn-out couch, her small form barely visible in the shadows. She had barely spoken since they'd arrived, but Jake could see the weight of what she was carrying in her eyes. It was the same weight he had carried for years. The weight of survival. They hadn't had much time to talk, but Jake could feel her growing restlessness. She wasn't the kind to sit still for long. Neither was he. The minutes ticked by slowly, the silence in the room heavy. The only sound was the occasional creak of the building, the soft hum of the city outside. Jake glanced at the girl, his gaze softening. She was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to hold herself together. He could see it in her eyes, fear, confusion, but also a flicker of something else. Strength. She was stronger than she realized. Jake had seen it in her from the moment he found her, terrified in the alley. She had been through things that most people couldn't even imagine, and yet, here she was, still standing. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in that. But he also knew that the worst was far from over. He couldn't keep her safe forever. He had made a promise to protect her, but promises were fragile things in a world like this. And right now, they were both walking on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the inevitable push. Jake rubbed his face, exhaustion creeping in as he thought about their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. The man from the diner, the one who had warned him, he would be back. And Jake didn't want to be here when that happened. His mind raced as he thought about where to go next. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere they could lie low, plan their next steps. But even that wasn't foolproof. No place was safe. The girl shifted on the couch, breaking his thoughts. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. "Where do we go now?" she asked quietly. Jake hesitated, not wanting to lie to her, but knowing that he had to. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. "For now, we stay here." She didn't say anything at first, but Jake could see the questions swimming in her eyes. She wanted to know how much longer, when they would finally be free of this nightmare. But Jake didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know. He had always been able to survive by trusting his instincts, by doing whatever it took to stay one step ahead of the world. But with the girl beside him, things were different. He had someone else to protect now, and that made everything harder. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. He couldn't afford to fail. The door to the back room creaked open, and Jake's hand immediately moved to the knife at his side. He didn't relax until he saw who it was. The owner of the bar stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You two still okay?" he asked, his voice low. Jake nodded, but he didn't trust the question. "For now," he replied, his voice flat. The owner's gaze flicked to the girl, then back to Jake. "It's getting dangerous out there. You can't stay here much longer." Jake's mind immediately went on high alert. He had expected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel real, even more urgent. "We're not staying," Jake said, his voice firm. "We'll be gone before anyone knows we're here." The owner nodded slowly, then stepped into the room. "I've got a place for you," he said, lowering his voice. "Out of town. It's safe, but not for long. You'll have to move quickly." Jake didn't hesitate. "Give us the details," he said. The owner walked over to the table, pulling a crumpled map from his pocket. He spread it out, pointing to a location deep in the woods, far from the city. "It's an old cabin. No one's been there for years. Should be off the grid enough for you two to lay low for a while. But you need to leave now. No time to waste." Jake studied the map, his mind working quickly. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. "How far?" he asked. 2 hours, maybe 3, the owner replied. Jake looked back at the girl, who had been listening quietly. "You ready?" he asked her. She nodded without saying a word, her expression determined. She had always been stronger than Jake gave her credit for. She had been through more than anyone her age should have to endure, and yet, she still found the strength to keep going. Jake stood up and walked toward the door, his mind already on the move. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had to get to the cabin. It was their only chance to escape, to disappear long enough to figure out what came next. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice low. The girl stood up, following him out of the room. They didn't say anything as they made their way through the bar, the owner giving them a silent nod as they left. Jake kept his eyes on the street as they stepped outside, the chill of the night air biting at his skin. Every step they took felt like a step toward something bigger, something they couldn't escape. But they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close to the only chance they had left. Jake and the girl had been on the move for hours, the roads empty and silent as they drove deeper into the wilderness. The cabin the bar owner had mentioned was isolated, far from the city, surrounded by dense woods that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to find them. At least, that's what Jake hoped. The weight of everything that had happened, the threats, the constant feeling of being hunted, was starting to take its toll. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but he couldn't let himself sleep. Not yet. Not when the danger was still too close. The girl sat quietly next to him, her eyes flicking nervously between the road ahead and Jake. She hadn't said much since they left the bar, but Jake could feel the tension between them. She was still processing everything, still carrying the fear that had been with her since the moment he found her. Jake didn't know how to help her. He wasn't a therapist. He wasn't good at talking about feelings or offering comfort. But he could keep her safe. That's all he had to offer. The headlights from their car cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the narrow road that wound deeper into the woods. Jake's grip tightened on the wheel as he turned another sharp corner, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. Every shadow felt like a threat now, every noise amplified in the stillness of the night. He had been running for too long, too many years, always looking over his shoulder, always afraid of what might be coming. But now, with her beside him, he was more afraid than ever. The girl had been through hell, and Jake wasn't sure how long he could keep running before it caught up with them. He glanced at her, her face pale in the dim light of the car. She was staring out the window, her fingers clutching the edge of the seat. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet, there was something in her eyes, something that told Jake she wasn't going to let this break her. She wasn't going to let anyone take her. And neither was he. The cabin appeared in the distance, barely visible through the trees. Jake's heart rate sped up, the feeling of relief mingling with the sense of urgency that had been building inside him. They were here. They were safe, for now. He turned the car off the main road and down a narrow dirt path, the tires crunching against the gravel as they approached the cabin. It was small, tucked away between the trees, surrounded by a high wooden fence that would keep anyone from stumbling upon it by accident. Jake pulled the car to a stop, cutting the engine. He sat there for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. This was it, the last safe place. He didn't know what would happen after this, but he knew that they couldn't stay on the run forever. He had to face the people after them eventually. He had to protect her, no matter what it took. He turned to the girl, who was still sitting quietly in her seat, her eyes lost in the darkness outside. "We're here," he said softly, his voice steady. She looked at him, her gaze distant for a moment before she nodded. Jake stepped out of the car and walked to the cabin's front door, his senses still on high alert. He was used to the feeling, used to the tension in the air that told him that peace was always temporary. He unlocked the door, pushing it open and stepping inside. The cabin was as he remembered, simple, with just the bare essentials. A small kitchen, a couple of old chairs, and a single bed covered in faded quilts. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Jake moved quickly, checking the windows, making sure the door was locked behind him. He turned to the girl, who had followed him inside, standing in the doorway. Her eyes flicked nervously around the room, taking in their surroundings. "This will have to do," Jake said, his voice low. She nodded again, but Jake could tell she wasn't convinced. She wasn't convinced that this would be the end of it. Jake wasn't either. He knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. The people who were after them wouldn't give up, not when they were so close. But for now, they had time. For now, they were safe. The girl moved toward the bed, sitting down slowly, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Jake walked over to her, sitting down beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just letting the silence hang between them. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make her feel any better. But he could tell that she was already starting to lose the fight against exhaustion. Her eyelids were heavy, and her body had finally started to relax. Jake glanced around the room, his thoughts racing. The silence was deafening, but the weight of it was comforting in a way. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't running. They were hidden. They were safe. For a little while. But Jake knew it wouldn't last. He could feel the storm on the horizon. The girl was already asleep, her head resting against the wall as she finally let go of the tension in her body. Jake watched her for a moment, his eyes softening. She had been through more than any child should have to go through, and yet she was still here. She was still fighting. And so was he. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the wood. But Jake didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not until he took down the ones who were after them. He lay down on the floor, his back against the cold wood, staring up at the ceiling. His mind kept replaying the events of the last few days. How he had found the girl, how they had fought their way out of danger, how they were now holed up in this tiny cabin with no plan and no way out. But the one thing Jake knew for sure was that he wasn't going to let her go. Not now. Not ever. I've got a thrilling story that will take you deep into the world of Hell Angel stories, filled with tension, mystery, and unexpected twists. Follow Jake, a tough biker, as he takes on a dangerous mission to protect a young girl who has seen things no one should. In this gripping tale, Jake faces off against powerful enemies, all while trying to keep the girl safe from those who want to harm her. As their journey unfolds, secrets are revealed, and the stakes grow higher, leading to a final confrontation that could change everything. In Hell Angel stories, survival is never guaranteed, and every choice can make the difference between life and death. The girl and Jake must navigate a dangerous path, with no clear way out. As they try to escape the enemies hunting them, they find themselves in a remote cabin, hidden from the world for now, but the storm is far from over. Their enemies are closing in, and they must fight for their lives. The Hell Angel stories never lack the excitement and suspense that keep you on the edge of your seat, and this one is no different. The tension is palpable, and the stakes have never been higher. What will happen next in these Hell Angel stories? You won't want to miss a moment of this thrilling ride filled with action, emotion, and a relentless quest for survival.